Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of Manitoba Alumni and Friends Virtual Learning for Life Fall 2020 series. My name is Tracy Bowman, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations and also a proud UM alumna and the moderator for today's session. Thank you to all of you for joining us and making this event part of your day. We've been able to offer this program free of charge to all of our 148,000 plus alumni living in 140 countries around the world, thanks to the very generous of one of the UM's affinity partners, IA Financial Group. Many thanks to them. Delivering learning for life opportunities is a very important role for the U of M, and we are proud to be able to showcase so many of our leading professors and researchers in this way. Now, just a few housekeeping details before I introduce our speaker for today. All of you are viewing this on YouTube, and we will have a recording of it afterwards, and we can send that to you along with our follow-up survey. Just to remind for all of those of you who are returning, you will be familiar with the platform Slido, which is the platform that we use for the Q&A. So that is www.sli.do, and the password is VL28. Now, I, as the moderator, will be able to see your questions, and I will ask your questions to our speaker on your behalf. If I make an error or misrepresent your question, or you have a follow-up question, do not hesitate to enter another question in there. We welcome all questions, and we will try to get through as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Lorrie Kirshenbaum, who will be presenting of how to mend a broken heart. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Kirshenbaum is a three-time graduate from the University of Manitoba. He's the Canada Research Chair in Molecular Cardiology and a professor of physiology and pathophysiology and of pharmacology and therapeutics at the UM's Max Rady College of Medicine. He's also the director of the Institute of Cardiovascular Sciences at the St. Boniface Hospital Albrechtsen Research Center and head of the Division of Cardiovascular Sciences and Disease. His Albrechtsen Research Center-based lab has been a world leader in the field of cell death for the last 25 years. Now, just very recently, like just a few days ago, Dr. Kirshenbaum was awarded with the 2020 Canadian Cardiovascular Society Research Achievement Award and is also the 2018 UM Distinguished Alumni Award recipient in the Professional Achievement category. I believe that we do have some of Dr. Kirshenbaum's colleagues and students from his lab participating in today's discussion, so welcome to all of them. So with that, over to you, Dr. Kirshenbaum.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. This is quite an honor. And quite frankly, when you had told me how many people around the world and previous alumni had graduated from the university who are signing in, I was kind of worried. I thought it was my mom perhaps just logging in multiple times, increasing the numbers. But that said, I'm truly delighted, and thank you for the very kind introduction. Hello to everyone. I hope we're all staying safe during these difficult times. Numbers in Manitoba have increased as they are increasing all over the world, and we're just trying to do our best to stay out of trouble, and hope your families and everybody else are well. With the virtual learning opportunity, it gives me a chance to talk about our work. I have to admit, this is my very first virtual lecture, so let's work together and see how this comes about. I decided to call the title of the talk, How to Mend a Broken Heart, and time is ticking because the focus of the lecture is really going to be on our body, circadian rhythm, and how basically it's a highly regulated process that allows us to live during the day and sleep during the night, and how it underlies disease. So let's go on this journey together. As Tracy mentioned, there'll be an opportunity to take questions at the end of the talk, and I look forward to interacting with you down this pathway. So as we move forward, I just want to mention that everyone has heard about the circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythms are biological rhythms that are very important for regulating many processes within our bodies, within our cells, and how these are coordinated on a daily basis. It's very important that we have this regulatory mechanism that we don't even think about, but essentially is there running in the background, and it keeps us healthy. And this is very, very important for maintaining health. So taking a look at this slide, this was taken from a picture of Albert Einstein. And what was interesting, given his theory of relativity and time consortiums, basically this is what he had said. The only reason for time is that everything doesn't happen all at once. And to some extent, I think that's really true. And we'll see in the next several slides how that really does make sense. So what is a circadian, and why is this important? And so the circadian rhythm is really a 24-hour cycle that regulates our physiological processes. It's found in basically all living organisms, plants, bacteria, fungi, and even bacteria. And it's based upon the fact that through evolution, at least on the Earth, we experience a 24-hour cycle, 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness. And I guess if we were living on another planet, the circadian rhythm would be obviously quite different. And again, it's based upon the 24-hour cycle that we have with day and night settings. It's very important in terms of how we recognize the environment with respect to environmental cues, our behavior, when we eat, when we sleep, and our biological processes, particularly metabolism and activity, are regulated by the circadian clock. And basically, as we'll see in the next little while, how really it's important for regulating many vital processes. So this slide basically is to show you that something that we're unaware of most of the time, but heart rate fluctuates. It's a very important measure of our activity, and we can see that throughout the day. I'm going to use my mouse here. You can see that over a 24-hour period, heart rate goes up, it comes down, and it cycles. It increases and decreases, and it certainly does this when we are active and when we sleep. And then the following chart on the right basically shows our blood pressure, and we can see that the blood pressure goes down when we're sleeping and it comes back up during the day. My blood pressure is probably a little higher than yours right now because I'm giving a talk, but the point is that blood pressure and heart rate fluctuate throughout the day and throughout our activity, and it truly is regulated in a circadian dependent manner. This basically demonstrates the expression of different stress hormones or catecholamines that are produced in our body, and how they vary and influence blood pressure or hemodynamics again throughout the day. And we can see blood pressure shown here in this yellow chart line on top, our heart rate down below, and then the plasma levels of one of these stress hormones, epinephrine, again fluctuates. And we can see that throughout the morning and toward the end of the day, we can see that these hormones go up, our heart rate goes up, and our blood pressure goes up. And then toward evening, when we taper off toward going to bed, these stress hormones tend to decrease, our heart rate decreases, and our blood pressure decreases. And so it's very interesting to see that these processes are very, very tightly regulated to our daily activity and our sleep-wake cycle. This is something that's also quite interesting and what we focused our research on over the past several years. In fact, the onset of acute cardiac disease or myocardial infarctions or heart attacks also vary in a circadian dependent manner. So in other words, there's a greater incidence of heart attacks on one part of the day versus other parts of the day. So in the morning, the incidence of heart attacks are greater than they are in the afternoon. And basically, we can see that this changes throughout the day. And so it seems to be that this is a marker for an enzyme that we can assess cardiac damage, myocardial creatine kinase. And this is released from damaged heart muscle cells, and it basically gives us the extent of cardiac injury. We can see that it changes with heart attack, and the incidence of heart attack, of course, fluctuates, and this affects our daily occurrences of heart disease. So the point is that even disease processes are regulated in a circadian dependent manner, with greater risk occurring at different times of the day. What I also wanted to show here was this is a chart of tachyarrhythmias or arrhythmias that occur, and an arrhythmia is a disturbance in the normal electrical activity in the heart. And so some people may have overbeats, or they may have something called PVCs, premature ventricular contractions, but it's just a simple irregularity in heart rate or rhythm. And essentially, you can see that during the time of day on the bottom, the incidence of these tachyarrhythmias or arrhythmias change. They peak and then they drop down and they cycle. And the reason for this is largely linked to the release of stress hormones or our activity. Sometimes we're running or we're exercising at different times of the day, and these different arrhythmias occur. But they occur in a circadian dependent manner, and some people may feel they get more arrhythmias in the afternoon than morning. But again, it's all genetically regulated through the circadian program. So I took this from Salvador Dali because it was an interesting piece. And so the question really is what happens when our circadian rhythms are disrupted? What happens when our clocks are disrupted? And this can happen during jet lag when we travel across the continent, or even social jet lag by staying out late at night on the weekends. That change in maybe 1 or 2 hours that we would otherwise go to bed affects our circadian. Individuals with sleep disorders such as sleep apnea don't sleep well, and they consequently have disrupted circadian rhythms. As I mentioned and shown on the first few slides, there's incidence of heart disease that are dependent upon the circadian rhythm, and metabolic disturbances, which is very tightly connected to the circadian. For example, diabetes and metabolic syndromes fluctuate and occur with the amount of food that we eat and when we eat, and effectively affect the circadian. So the circadian not only affects what we do and how we do it, our activities feed back and influence the circadian. So there's this very close interrelationship between our daily activities and our health, and how that's altered when our clocks are somehow altered. So the point I'm trying to make in this slide is that time is very important. And that's something that we don't seem to have a lot of these days because of the high stress jobs that we typically have, the running, the picking up children, going to the gym, grocery shopping, etc. Daily activity takes time, and this is something that we underestimate as being something very important for our health. So let's put this into some perspective. What about shift workers, and what happens in individuals with rhythm disturbances that occur? People have their day and night shifted. And so the next few slides, I'm going to talk about why that's important. So many of us typically have a normal circadian rhythm that I mentioned is tied to the day and night light cycles. So we sleep during the evenings and we're awake during the day, and some of us have variations within that. But shift workers in particular have their biological clocks inverted. So they're usually sleeping when we're awake and sleeping when we're awake. So it's quite upside down, if you will, and it's very difficult for many individuals to adjust. And consequently, shift workers in particular are predisposed to greater incidence of health disease and health disorders, particularly cardiovascular disease. They have a greater incidence of cardiovascular disease outcomes, largely because of their circadian being disrupted. Some of the disturbances and some of the events that occur predominantly when the circadian is disrupted, and this isn't just restricted to shift workers, it's just in general when the circadian is misaligned, the greater incidence of heart attack. So despite heart attack being regulated in the morning versus afternoon or different events, disruption of the circadian leads to a greater incidence of heart attack, greater incidence of arrhythmias. The incidence of sudden death is increased when individuals are either sleep deprived or have the circadian disruption. As I mentioned in the previous slides, there's changes in blood pressure and high blood pressure, hypertension. And evidence that diseases like aortic dissection or diseases where the blood vessels become damaged also follow a circadian rhythm and are also greater incidence when circadian rhythm is disrupted. And lastly, the events following angioplasty or aortic valve replacement, this is percutaneous interventions for angioplasty, for putting stents in, have a different outcome in the morning than they do in the afternoon, and that was quite surprising. We published an article in a journal called Circulation, which is one of the top-ranked cardiovascular journals, last February. One of my talented postdocs we'll hear a little bit about her work a little later, and I wrote this article, and it was quite interesting because we found differences in the literature demonstrating the incidence of heart disease being greater in the morning than afternoon. And if aortic valves or surgery was performed in the afternoon, the outcomes, irregardless of the comorbidities, underlying disease, or the surgeon, tended to be better in the afternoon than they were in the morning. And again, it's a circadian dependent mechanism. So we don't know if the surgeon was performing better or the body was better prepared for the afternoon surgery. But the point is that there is a surgically dependent outcome for these events. So one of the things that we learned from the great Dr. Eugene Brunwald in our world, in the world of cardiology, Brunwald was and still is one of the grandfathers and pioneers of the field. And as an intern back in '52, he recognized that quiet and sleep was very important. And I just want to read a quote that I took from one of his publications in Circulation, this journal where this work was published. As an intern in 1952, we admitted patients with AMI, this is acute myocardial infarction, wherever a bed was available on the medical service, but always as far away from the nurse's station as possible, so that they would not be disturbed by the commotion, especially the frequent phone ringing. So even before the science of circadian biology or chronobiology had evolved, it was recognized early on that disturbances in sleep, and particularly in ICU settings, have a major effect on our biological clock and disease outcome. And it's quite interesting to see how this was recognized as early as 1952. So one of the things that I'm going to share with you, and I've mentioned a little bit about this over the past couple slides, is more of an informational sharing, in that the segue into our science. But this was really quite interesting, and I've alluded to this, that shift workers are at greater risk of cardiovascular disease. The incidence of acute myocardial infarction seemed to be greater after a time shift. So one of the things that we got to be aware of is next week we're going to be changing our clock. And what was interesting is that this was documented evidence that within the first 3 weeks after a transition from daylight savings to springtime, there was a greater incidence of heart attack. And so for that reason, there's been a great push not to change time. And I believe next year we're going to retain the same time throughout the year because of increased incidence of car accidents, heart disease, and many other events, but they all link to time and change in day, light that we typically see. So this is not trivial. This is a real phenomenon. I mentioned earlier that the heart rate is highest in the day and it slows at night. We know our blood pressure changes. It rises and falls as we sleep. It's highest in the morning, usually falls throughout the day, and some individuals, we call these our non-dippers. So the blood pressure is rising and dipping, but some individuals don't experience this, and they too experience greater incidence of heart disease. So our blood pressure changes, and why that becomes very important throughout the night is that some individuals take medication during the night for lowering their blood pressure, and there's some instances where, take the time of day where medication is taken, not only if it's regular, but different times of the day may affect disease outcome. So as I mentioned, this chart below just gives you an overview. It's not carved in stone, but just an overview how the circadian rhythm influences disease outcome. So a greater incidence of heart attack in early morning, evidence that there's increased stroke in the early morning, subarachnoid bleed. This is also a form of stroke during the daytime. Atrial fibrillation, common to many individuals, morning and night, and of course ventricular arrhythmias occur in the morning. This incidence in the morning has been attributed to, especially on Monday mornings, people attributed to going back to work. So after having a nice restful weekend or party weekend or having friends and family over for dinner or whatever the choice, having to go to work Monday morning basically is a stress response. And this has been suggested to be one of the underlying mechanisms for the greater incidence of heart disease in the mornings, particularly on a Monday, than other times during the day. This cartoon basically demonstrates different biological processes and how they vary throughout the day. So they're occurring and we're even unaware of it. And so Peruvian man here in the middle, basically we start at noon. We can see that we go throughout the entire cycle, that our best coordination and best activities are somewhere in the afternoon, somewhere over here. And our greatest cardiovascular efficiency is somewhere between, let's say, 2:30 and 5 o'clock. And if you ever watch an Olympic event, particularly the long or quick distance running, is always in the afternoon. And despite it being probably optimal time for sponsors for that period of time, our peak optimal performance physically is in the afternoon. So chances are, if you're exercising and you go for a run, you'll probably get a better run later in the afternoon because your body is tuned because of these biological processes than it might otherwise be in the morning. As you can see, as we move throughout the night toward the night-evening area, there's changes in different hormonal secretions, melatonin, other cardiovascular regulating hormones are changed. And as we move toward deep sleep, there's changes in our body temperature, more changes in our testosterone and estrogen levels, and then we become awake. And some people require coffee, some otherwise. The coffee really doesn't do it. It's basically the caffeine in the coffee that simulates these heart hormones, these cardiac hormones that kind of give you that little boost in the morning. But our highest alertness is usually in the morning, and mental alertness anyway. And then throughout the day, of course, it changes. So you can see that this diagram illustrates how these biological processes influence our behavior and our psychological state. So what is the circadian rhythm and how is it regulated, and what controls it? So in the deep recesses of our brain, there is something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And basically it serves as the pacemaker. It's basically the central clock, and it responds to light. So light comes in through the eyes, it's processed in this region in the brain, and essentially will regulate the different hormones and outputs that are responsible for regulating the peripheral clock. So here's heart rate, kidney function, and essentially all of these impinge on regulating biological activity. And so this suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is located in the brain and coordinated with the eyes, is critical for regulating the circadian activity. And the big deal about this was the Nobel Prize in 2017 was awarded to Jeffrey Hall, Michael Robash, and Michael Young. And basically, why they got the Nobel Prize was their early biological work on the circadian rhythm and understanding its importance not only through regulating different biological processes, but how important it was in regulating disease. And I had the opportunity to meet Michael Robash, and a very, very nice man. And it was interesting. This slide, I don't know, historically, the Nobel folks always have this sort of rendering of the 3 Nobel winners. And I also came across, let's just go to, let's see if this will go. Also came across this slide. So I hope that they understand. I don't know what we make of it, but anyway, these individuals were also very prominent in the field as well. And so you can make of it what you want, but we're highly respectful of those individuals and how they came across these biological processes. Their work basically identified a molecular signal at the cellular level and in our cells at the gene level that these processes are regulated by various transcription factors. And I think this is going to be the extent of my talk on molecular signaling. But essentially, the biology of the circadian regulation in our cells is identifiable by certain genes and proteins that get activated in a sequential manner. And so the Nobel Prize was awarded to these individuals because of the fact they discovered that certain genes were activated in a sequential manner by different transcription factors shown here. And these are different proteins called cryptochrome, period, clock, etc. And they bind to DNA in our genes that basically regulate the function. And that's essentially a really critical demonstration of how the circadian mechanism at the molecular level works. So one of the other things that came across were something called Zeitgebers. And Zeitgebers are really timekeepers. It's a German word for timekeeper or synchronizer. And essentially what that meant was that the circadian had to be synchronized in some way. And so different hormones and different chemicals and whatever we typically ate or drank and influenced our nutrient intake or exercise were acting as Zeitgebers. They could actually reset the clock. And shown here, we can see that as an example, glucose, which is found in different foods, and sugar, of course, could act as a Zeitgeber to reset the clock, as well as one of the stress hormones, norepinephrine. And changes in the expression of blood pressure or changes in the expression of heart rate activity could be changed. And it was one of the first ideas of this idea of chronotherapy, that we could use different hormonal systems or drugs or nutrients to influence the clock, and as a result influence our daily activities. And now there's an entire study on chronobiology and chronotherapy in terms of trying to treat human disease based upon modifying these different biological processes. So one of the things that's quite interesting about the circadian is I mentioned the central pacemaker being located in the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain. But it turns out that basically every tissue in the body, whether it be the lung, the liver, the kidney, the heart, has its own biological rhythm that's controlled centrally by the clock. So the clock in our brains basically sends out signals to the different organ systems and essentially guides these organ systems or provides instruction on how to function. So it serves as a central pacemaker of all these different biological processes. However, independent of this global pacemaker, the lung, the heart, the kidney can be doing their own biological rhythms, and they respond differently throughout the day. And so this is what makes our biological control very, very complex. And so the coordination, the timing becomes quite important. So just to show you how this is really integrated, if we take a look at metabolism, our endocrine system, our reproductive system, our immune system, and cardiovascular, they're all coordinated uniformly by the circadian regulator, the pacemaker in our brain. But at the same time, they have their own pacemakers systems where they can control their own activities. And so why this becomes important is because different timing of the day may have an effect on the kidney, but not on the heart or on our endocrine system. So for metabolism, and particularly the pancreas, which is an important endocrine organ for regulating our glucose metabolism through insulin secretion, it's very important that this process take place in a very timely and ordered fashion. So when we eat, our metabolism changes. It causes the release of different hormones. These hormones then affect different biological processes and ultimately affect our health. So eating at different times of the day, whether we're told to eat at certain parts of the day, morning, afternoon, night, that's one thing. Some people graze, some people don't. Some people eat late at night, have a huge effect on our biological processes and the different organ systems that regulate these biological processes. I'm segueing now into how these changes affect human disease. And so I showed earlier in one of the slides that blood pressure fluctuates throughout the day. There's no question. There's daylight, in response to day and night variation, there's changes in blood pressure and heart rate, and they go up and they go down, and they change when we awake and when we sleep. But I want to focus on the cardiovascular events. As I mentioned, that there's greater incidence of cardiovascular events in the morning than there may be in the afternoon. And that might be related to changes in blood pressure or heart rate or the release of hormones. But I wanted to impress upon you this particular slide because in the next few slides, I want to explain to you some of the work that we've been doing in terms of understanding how these biological processes impact on heart disease. So if you take a look, I mentioned this very, very briefly. If our blood pressure is going up and down, and many of us take blood pressure or lipid-lowering drugs or other drugs for our health, depending upon the time of day that you take them. Some drugs have to be taken with food just because they have side effects that upset our stomachs, or they affect different biological functions. And it's important if you're taking a medication multiple times a day is to take it that same time. If you can remember, if you're taking it in the afternoon, take it in the afternoon, take it in the morning, take it in the morning. It's very important that you continue to take the medication at the same time of day. But it also depends upon the type of drug that you're taking. If some individuals, if their blood pressure is decreased when we sleep, it raises the question if someone should be taking a blood pressure medication at night. And so the side effects and the actual physiology of a given drug may have different outcomes and different effects on our body given on the time of day that we're taking it. So it's important to make sure that if you are taking medication, that you take it consistently and at the right time of day when you're instructed to take it, and to keep up with it because it affects many different processes. But what I did want to impress upon here was the fact that different times of the day on our circadian can directly not only be affected by the drugs that we take, but also it can affect the outcome of what the drugs do to our bodies. So as I mentioned earlier, that one of the things that we found was that myocardial infarction or heart attack are more frequently to occur in the morning. And I mentioned earlier that this might be due to a mismatch between the increased blood pressure and changes in heart rate and potentially energy metabolism. And this might also be due to the fact that in the mornings people are anxious getting out of bed, getting to work, thinking about what they may have to do during the day. And it just has to do with many functions. But the point is, it's not just one organ system that's affected. We see this as heart attack, but effectively what happens is many cells in the body and many organ systems in the body are also affected. So it's a global response to circadian control. And so why this becomes important is because it affects many different organ systems, and the outcome ultimately can be quite dramatic. So this was a slide taken from a colleague of mine, Dr. Martino at the University of Guelph. And what they wanted to do was to change the circadian rhythm in a hamster model. And these hamsters are otherwise quite active. And what I just wanted to show you here was they manipulated a gene called tau, which interferes with the circadian activity. And as a result, the locomotor activity, the activity of these animals actually decreased when the circadian gene was interfered with. And this is just a blot to show that the different bands represent the presence and absence of the gene. And these are called actinograms or activitygrams, and they basically measure or monitor the activity of the animal. And what was interesting was that animals that didn't have this particular gene, so their activity was altered, had altered cardiac function. And so why I show this is it's quite demonstrative that the normal tissue is shown here. This is heart tissue that had been taken from these animals, and it's normal and it's pink, and it shows the heart muscle that's quite uniform and shown here quite nicely. But after 24 hours of inactivity, the tau mouse, the mouse that didn't have the circadian gene, basically had a gross increase in fibrosis. You can see this blue area here indicating that the muscle tissue was damaged, and essentially the mouse tissue, the heart muscle, was actually quite enlarged. So effectively, it demonstrated a direct link between disrupting the circadian rhythm and poor cardiac outcome just in changing its biological activity. So the mouse became inactive, and ultimately, or in this case, pardon me, the hamster was inactive, and as a result, it developed more scar and cardiac dysfunction. So one of the areas that my lab has been focused on, that Tracy mentioned at the outset, was understanding mechanisms that lead to cell death in the heart. And We are interested in understanding why the heart muscle cells die during heart attack, largely because heart muscle doesn't regenerate once it becomes damaged. And so as a result, the muscle becomes fibrotic, like I showed in the previous slide, and its ability to pump blood diminishes. And so during the night when we sleep, these processes that regulate cell death and other housekeeping processes called autophagy or autophagy are activated, and they basically are there to remove waste metabolites. They're there to remove damaged cells from our tissues, and basically serve as a quality control mechanism to kind of tidy up and remove any kind of damaged organelles or mitochondria or other organelles in the cell that may have demised while normal activity. And so if those cells aren't repaired or cleared, what happens is they accumulate and as a result cause cardiac injury. And it's not only in the heart but in other tissues. But in the heart in particular, because the heart muscle doesn't regenerate once it becomes damaged, if these systems don't work properly, then ultimately the heart muscle will fail. And so what I just wanted to show here in there in this slide is a picture. This is an electron micrograph of a what's called an autophagosome. And this autophagosome shown here is a circular vesicle, and it contains inside of it these smaller vesicles that basically show that it's basically encapsulating and removing damaged proteins from the cell. And this is an important protective quality control mechanism. And why I show this is because in the graphs below, this autophagic process, which is quite important, as I mentioned, for maintaining heart function, changes throughout the day and changes when we sleep. And so let me put this into a different perspective by showing the next slide. So autophagy is this process that basically results in the accumulation, results in the removal of the accumulation of damaged organelles. And essentially, it's, again, very genetically regulated. It allows the cell to remove damaged cargo that's shown here, and essentially remove it in a nice, tidy process. So it's a housekeeping mechanism. And I think in the next slides that I'll show you, it basically shows this quite dramatically. This would be no different than if we had waste accumulating in our house. So these are examples of empty water bottles that would accumulate, and they would accumulate, but unfortunately, they'd accumulate and we have them taken away, and then essentially if we don't put them into a blue bin, essentially to remove them, they would accumulate and as a result cause damage. So normally you put your recyclables in the blue bin, it gets taken away and life is good. But what happens is if there was a problem in the removal process of this waste product, essentially, for example, the truck broke a wheel or it was damaged for some reason, essentially what would happen is that these water bottles, in analogy to waste products, would accumulate. And ultimately, our house, our quality control mechanisms for removing this damaged waste would accumulate and cause a decrease in our ability to live, and ultimately would affect cardiac function. And that's exactly what happens. And so my lab is focused on these processes and the genes that I showed in the previous slide that are responsible for regulating how these damaged processes are removed. And in the red box, we focused our attention on a protein called BNP3, which is a gene which is activated in the heart under stress conditions, and it plays a role in quality control and removal of some of these damaged proteins. And this just shows here, again, an electron micrograph I want to show on the far right, that if we look closely, the arrows point in red to these circular structures, and one can look very closely and actually see that the mitochondria are engulfed, just like in that cartoon, trying to clear up those damaged organelles. And basically, this is an important process for keeping the healthy cell health and normal heart function. What I want to show here is that these are normal cells, and these are cells that contain the protein BNP3. You can see a few of these little dots, which demonstrate the presence or the removal of these cargoes. And when you remove the gene, we can actually see that the cargoes are actually removed. You don't see them. But when you put the gene back in, all of a sudden you start seeing the presence of these cargo or these proteins, and they're going to be removed from the cell. So we identified that this gene called BNIP3 is really important for regulating quality control within the cell, and essentially for removing damaged organelles and what we call mitochondria or Golgi or any of the other organelles that might be important for regulating the normal cell function. We also wanted to look at this in terms of the autophagic process and in terms of circadian. And what we found was the fact that under different conditions, we can see that this gene, BNIP3, also fluctuates in a time-dependent manner. And so in contrast to heart muscle cells, we look in kidney cells, and we can see that even if you look not being an expert necessarily in the field, we can see that the expression of this particular gene is changed in heart muscle, where it's changed differently in kidney cells. We can see here it goes up in some cases, and in some cases it's not as expressed. And we look at the 6-hour time here and the 6-hour time there. And the brilliance of the slide shows that the gene is important not only in regulating the removal of these damaged proteins, but it's regulated differently in the different cell types. So this is one of the things I had wanted to impress upon you in terms of the role of these proteins in the regulating circadian-dependent quality control mechanisms. So one of my postdocs, as I mentioned, Ina Rabinovich Nikitin, who has been in the lab now for close to 3 years and funded by the CIHR to look at some of the work that we've been engaged in, asked a question about shift workers and asked the question, what happens to shift workers and why are they at greater risk for cardiovascular disease? And could this be related to changes in their quality control mechanisms? Because essentially nothing was known at the time. So Ina embarked in a project which was really quite interesting, where she basically took 3 groups of mice. And essentially she shifted their time. Normally the mice would have 12 hours light time, 12 hours nighttime, and essentially she shifted their time instead of from 12 hours daylight to 10 hours daylight and 10 hours of sleep versus 12 hours of sleep. So she basically stole 2 hours of light and 2 hours of darkness and gave little heart attacks to these animals to see the outcome. And this procedure was for 5 days, simply changing the rhythm in these animals for 5 days by stealing 2 hours in the morning and at night by depriving them of sleep, resulted in something quite dramatic. So initially there was no difference in these cardiac parameters, no changes in the blood pressure, no changes in the heart rate. Everything was basically the same in these animals when you compare them at baseline levels. But after heart attack, what was very interesting was the fact that there was an increased infarct size, meaning the amount of cardiac damage was greater in the shift-worked mice, if we call them shift-worked mice. We saw that the heart-to-body weight ratio was increased, so their heart muscle enlarged. Their ability to pump blood or their stroke volume was actually changed, and it was decreased. And basically their ability to deliver blood through something called cardiac output was diminished. And I'll depict that here in this diagram. This is the normal, what's called a pressure volume loop. This is normal, and one can see here that in red, these are the shift works. You can see how diminished the cardiac function is from this point to this point, and how narrow this width is to that. So basically changing the mouse's circadian by 2 hours for 5 days had this dramatic effect on physiology. And if we looked at their hearts, these are what are called pineapple slices. They're transverse sections through the heart. These are the normal heart, sham or just normal animals. These are normal animals that had heart attacks. You can see the walls here are dilated. Pardon me here, these are the normal ones. And if you look at the shift-worked mouse, look how dilated, how enlarged the muscle is, and how thin it is. And this clearly demonstrates that the shift-worked mice, or the mice that were simulated to be shift workers, had greater incidence of myocardial infarction and greater cardiac damage than the normal mice. accordingly. So this was very profound and quite dramatic. And Ina went on then to characterize some of the genes that are important for the quality control. And what's important here is the diagram on the histograms on the far right, which show that the classical genes that I mentioned earlier that are important for mitochondrial quality control are diminished in the shift-worked mouse model than in the normal. And this basically confirmed our idea, but proved the fact that quality control mechanisms that are important are activated when we sleep for removing damaged organelles or damaged proteins from the body are impaired, and as a result accumulate and result in cardiac dysfunction. Oops, I had a slide here. I guess maybe it didn't come up. I want to see if I can find it, because that's actually quite important. So I wanted to show here that these are the normal hearts. These are the shift work that didn't experience heart attack. And then these are the hearts that did experience heart attack after shift work. And we can see the accumulation of these damaged proteins and organelles, damaged mitochondria. And it confirmed our theory that, in fact, that the inability of these hearts, particularly because of the disruption of the circadian mechanisms, resulted in the impaired cardiac function. So ultimately, I think that ends my talk. I just want to conclude and say that circadian rhythms play a crucial role in cardiovascular health. We know that disturbing circadian rhythms cause heart disease and worsen cardiac outcomes. We know that shift work in particular exacerbates and predisposes to shift work to cardiac outcome, and shift workers in particular need to be very cognizant of this because of the fact that they're at greater risk for cardiovascular abnormalities. We learned from our studies that changes in quality control and these autophagy processes are really affected by the circadian, and disruption of the circadian affects the way these quality control mechanisms work. And we believe that interventions that realign the circadian through sleep or through different additives, nutrients, may be important for regulating good cardiovascular health. And there's something about this. If you take the take-home message is that a lot of people suggest that if they want to lose weight, not to eat after 8 o'clock. And if you really think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because if you don't eat, and presumably in early times where people were going to bed early and let's say not eating after 8 o'clock and sleeping, and they had 12 hours of sleep, that was the time where your body had an opportunity to get rid of some of these damaged waste products and damaged proteins. But as soon as you start eating, particularly late at night, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, and somebody has some interest in eating, it immediately changes the circadian pattern. And the removal system, this quality control removal system of damaged organelles and proteins, is disrupted. And you can well imagine that this is part of what we believe to be a contributing factor to heart disease. So the last take-home message here is that sleep and circadian rhythms are critical for maintaining good cardiovascular health. And so with that, I'm going to just basically acknowledge the funding bodies over the years, CIHR, the Canada Research Chairs Program, Heart and Stroke Foundation, of course, the University of Manitoba for their continual and unwavering support of my research program, our research program here at St. Boniface Hospital, and the Physiology Department. We're very grateful, and to them for all their help. And of course, my talented crew for doing this work. Ina is right here, and hopefully we're going to be able to keep her on as faculty on completion of her postdoctoral training here at the University of Manitoba. I think she's a star, and hopefully she'll be able to take this work further. So with that said, I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you again for taking the time during your day to spend with me and listen to some of the work that we've been engaged in. I'm really honored that you are here with us this afternoon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kirshenbaum. That was really interesting. So I think we can all admit that sleep is important and we all should be getting more sleep in. I think I see study after study sharing that we're not getting enough sleep as a society for various different reasons, particularly in terms of increased stress, as we're seeing and as you were mentioning earlier on, right? I mean, stress plays a big role in our ability to get sleep as well. So I have a question of my own, but I'm going to save it for a little bit later. We have had one question come in that I would like to read, and that is, can folks who are shift workers repair the damage once they stop that activity of being a shift worker?
Yeah, it's a really great question. One of the things that we're looking at now is just to see if you can regain that protectiveness. And our early studies are yes. It's interesting to see how resilient the body is. And when I use the word plastic, how malleable our biological systems are. So the example with shift work, it might be chronic shift work, but a great example is even jet lag. You know how individuals, if we travel frequently, I travel a lot, and so crossing a couple time zones, I can do that pretty regularly now and adjust. My wife, on the other hand, who doesn't travel quite as much, has a harder time adjusting. Same thing with shift workers. Shift workers, they develop a muscle memory, if you will, and they can adjust really rapidly to the shift work change, and then they can revert back. And it's believed that their physiological processes will also revert back. But again, it's a great question that we're currently exploring.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what about as we go north and south? The day-night division changes considerably. So how does this affect the circadian?
Yeah, another terrific question. Up north, as you know, there could be days where there is no light at all, and it's basically darkness. Those individuals living in those conditions are really stressed, and we see more of what are called affective disorders in terms of psychological behaviors, and it's recommended that they have light therapy. In fact, light therapy has been used. A certain not only frequency of light but also duration of light can make a huge difference. And so yes, up north where there's constant darkness, or even south where there's constant light, is an issue, and those individuals are at greater risk for health problems.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, as we wait for some more questions to come in, I'm going to ask my own question, and that is, what kept running through my head when you were speaking was about autoimmune diseases, and one of those issues is how their sleep patterns are affected. So, maybe this is a silly question, but is there a relationship between autoimmune diseases and cardiovascular diseases?
Yeah, another great question. One of the things that we've been thinking about is in the context of even COVID and other types of diseases that involve our immune system. Our immune system is absolutely affected in a circadian dependent manner. And so autoimmune diseases, which refer to changes or an ability of the body to develop antibodies against our tissues, and that's why they're called autoimmune, are affected in a circadian dependent manner. And so a lot of times people who don't sleep or are sleep deprived become more susceptible to infection because their immune system is somewhat compromised. And so there's no, there's a lot of anecdotal information on our infectivity and ability to become infected, but our immune systems are definitely affected, and we see this in the presence of inflamed cells and inflammatory cells in the hearts after heart attack in circadian disrupted individuals.
Okay, thank you. So we've had a whole pile of questions come in as I just asked that one. So one of them is, what about taking melatonin?
Yeah, melatonin has been shown as a circadian regulator. It does affect the pineal gland in the brain. It does affect the global pacemaker circadian clock, and it's been effective in some individuals for resynchronizing the circadian clock. Some people take it for sleep and it works quite well. Others take it and there's no effect. But if there is quite a bit of interest in understanding how it may affect health outcomes as well, particularly cardiovascular health.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, what are the genes involved in circadian rhythm?
Oh, this must be from a genetic person, and I love the question. The names of the genes were identified originally based upon, and they're really cute. There's several genes. There's a positive arm that activates the circadian rhythm, and there's a negative arm that inhibits it. And some of the genes that activate it are called clock. Some of them are called bimol. One's called per or period. There are three of that family: per, period 1, 2, and 3. There's other genes called cryptochrome, cryptochrome 1, 2, and 3, and several others. But it's interesting how these genes interact with each other. They feed forward and feed back, and basically it's a coordinated interplay between these genes on how the actual circadian loops and biology are regulated.
Okay, next question. Does circadian only affect the heart?
Yeah, the circadian affects all body organisms, all body organs, and all organisms that we're aware of are affected in a circadian dependent manner. So the heart is affected, kidneys, lungs, liver, skin, all our organ systems are affected by the circadian.
Okay, thank you. Should morning heart surgeries be avoided?
Oh, wow. I don't know how to answer that question, largely because of the fact that the outcomes seem to be better in the afternoon than in the morning. But the information that was published was specifically on aortic valve replacement. And it, again, I'm careful on how I answer this question because there are many factors that play into outcomes. And right now, I think if individuals are scheduled for cardiac surgery in the morning, and it's a matter of life or death, then the answer is no. The answer is you have the surgery when the surgery is available. I think some of the information that came out showing that cardiac outcomes were better in the afternoon didn't imply that all cardiac surgery should only be done in the afternoon, because that would obviously be impractical.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What happens to someone who is blind?
So people who are blind have something called have a syndrome that allow them to have a circadian rhythm, but it's not regulated by light. There are medications that I'm aware of that are used to treat individuals with blindness. Their circadian rhythms are disrupted, obviously, because they're not based upon a light cycle. Their tissue their tissue systems are regulated differently. And I just want to see if I had in my slide set, because I typically do. Where's it here? There's some drugs that are given to individuals to particularly blind individuals that don't respond obviously to light as cues, but they can be given drugs that will trigger the circadian to respond in a cyclic manner. That can help. It's referred to as 24/7, and these individuals obviously still have the incidence of heart disease and other forms of disease, but their circadian is regulated much differently.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I find this to be a really interesting question because I'm a bit of a nighthawk myself, but it says, are nighthawks more susceptible to heart disease, those who stay up late but still get their 8 hours of sleep?
I like to stay up too. So you know what? There are morning people and there are night people. And the issue comes down to the quality of sleep as well. So if you're up night, you go to bed at night and you're getting your 8 hours of sleep, and it's quality sleep, then the answer is no. The answer is that your risk of heart disease or other health issues is likely not the same risk as individuals who are typically awake or can't sleep. Someone who can't sleep at night or that's waking up in the middle of the night has a disrupted sleep pattern is different. Circadian and sleep, they typically go together, but they're not the same. A circadian rhythm is a biological rhythm, whereas we tend to regulate it when we sleep. So staying up at night, and I want to comment on that, staying up at night, as long as you're getting 8 hours or 7 hours sleep, whatever your body needs, you're perfectly okay. It's when the sleep is actually disrupted. Also, I might want to add that blue emitters, people tend to look at their cell phones or blue light emitters, their cell phones or tablets emit blue light, and blue light is notorious for disrupting the circadian rhythm. So a lot of people who read their tablets before they go to bed at night typically have problems falling asleep because their circadian is messed up because of the blue emitted light. And so it's suggested that kids and adults not necessarily use their tablets or blue emitter devices before they go to bed.
That's very interesting. Okay, so we'll try to get through a few more of these questions because there's a number of them. One is, I took part in a heart study at the U of M for women's heart issues. Have you seen any differences related to a person's sex?
Yes, that's a very good question and very important. Some of the studies that have come out have shown that women are protected against heart attack. Some of the work by my colleague Tammy Martino has shown that the incidence and size of the infarcts, the amount of heart damage, is less in females than it is in males. And that's something that may be hormonally related. We don't know at this point. But there's clearly evidence to suggest that women do better than males do, and that's been known for some time, but even with disrupted circadian rhythms.
Okay, I'm going to go through two more questions, so just trying to go through this here. How did you become interested in circadian biology?
Our interest originally was in, and it still is, understanding why the heart muscle cells die after a heart attack. Because heart muscle doesn't regenerate, essentially what happens is the heart muscle loses its ability to pump blood and ultimately results in heart failure. And my interest in the circadian came about wondering if, in fact, some of these processes that do lead to housekeeping quality control were somehow regulated in a circadian manner. And one of the genes that we had been studying for years, regulating cell death, had also been important in regulating this autophagy process, this housekeeping control system. And that's where we started with it. And it became quite interesting for us because it's now taken us down an unexplored path, which I find to be quite exciting.
Okay, and the last question I'll ask, it's a nice final question, which is, how would you like to further your studies?
Oh, thank you so much. What I would like to do is to be able to understand the mechanisms that link circadian and quality control to heart muscle function, and so that we can develop new therapies, to chronotherapies that affect the circadian and ultimately affect cardiac outcomes after surgery or prior to surgery, and to lessen the risk of heart disease. Because nowadays it's a function of not only what we eat, it's our physical activity, it's whether we sleep, whether we have disrupted lifestyles. The incidence of heart disease is increased, and I think that by understanding these pathways, we'll have a better handle on developing new therapies. There are therapies on the market now that have been suggested to work this way, and so we're hoping our research will lead to new avenues and development of new therapies that will decrease the incidence of heart disease, increase quality of life.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thank you for answering all those questions. And many apologies to everybody who asked questions and I just was not able to get to them. So We will be sending you a link to today's presentation, as we do normally, as well as a follow-up survey. We hope that you do share your thoughts and feedback, as it's the only way that we are able to make changes and we're able to improve. So I encourage you, if you haven't registered already, to join us next week when you will hear from Dr. Verena Menick. She's also a 3-time alum, and she will be presenting on the topic of social isolation and loneliness. Why are they a public health risk, and what are the possible solutions? There have been some articles written about this topic on Today, so I do encourage you to go there too to learn a little bit more about it. But with that, thanks again to everyone for spending the last hour with us, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you.